Kendra with Trust TV, and I'm back with another video, y'all. And I just wanted to have this conversation today because this was something that was on my mind, and I wanted to get this right because the math historically. We done heard every type of conversation we need to hear about the true American Indians, but I got a couple of questions that I want to know who can answer. Can y'all ask me this? If American Indians or so-called Native Americans had to learn how to cultivate the land, right? They had to learn how to cultivate the land in a boarding school. Can somebody riddle me this, Batman? Who taught the Africans how to farm? Because we already heard about the Spanish, we heard about the Portuguese, we heard about the Europeans, and they said that the American Indian taught these people how to farm, right? So who the hell is the Native Americans who had to go to boarding school to learn how to farm? Does that make sense? Who are the Native Americans? Because if I'm not mistaken, the Spanish, the Europeans, Scottish, Irish, French, the Pilgrims, them niggas didn't know how to farm. They were dying of starvation. So the same Europeans that was dying of starvation is teaching Native Americans how to farm. Make that make sense? Because if that was so and the Europeans knew how to farm, then why were they dying of starvation? If they were bringing foreign crops to the Americas to plant them in the Americas, why would they be dying of starvation if they knew how to cultivate the lands to put foreign fruits and vegetables into the ground to teach the Native Americans? You get what I mean? How would they know when they had to learn for the Native Americans or the so-called the Indians, the so-called Native Americans, how to cultivate the land? Does that make sense? Because they're going to try to spit to you that, the Europeans taught. Well, that don't make no sense. It's not adding up. If the Europeans was taught by the American Indian how to farm, how can the same Europeans that were taught by the Indian how to farm have to go and now teach the Native Americans how to farm on the land of their nativity? Make that make sense. Like, it just don't even add up, no way, shape, or form. Can somebody explain to me? Because if the Indians taught these people, I'm going to repeat myself. If the Indians taught these people how to farm, can somebody explain who the hell the Native Americans who had to go to Indian school to learn how to farm is? Because y'all saying these Native Americans and Indians the same people. How so? Because the Europeans that didn't know how to farm learned from the American Indians how to farm, and then the Native Americans went to boarding schools to learn how to farm. So that would mean that Native Americans and American Indians are not even the same people. They came at they were at two different time frames. Native Americans came after, because that's when they went into the boarding schools to learn how to farm. Because the American Indians taught the European, Spanish, Pilgrim, and everybody else how to farm. And then after the European, Spanish, and Portuguese learned from the Indians how to farm, they then turned around and made a school for the Native Americans to learn how to farm. Because if Native Americans were the true American Indians, you would never have to go to school to become an Indian. Because when I go to school for nursing, I'm not a nurse first. I go to school to become a nurse. So it's called Indian school. So you had to go to school to become an Indian. You weren't at first. That would explain why you would be taught how to agriculture and farming on your own land. How can a European teach you that when they were dying of starvation? Like, y'all, it's not mathing. But you bought Africans who somehow magically know how to cultivate lands you didn't even know how to cultivate? When we know that the soil of Africa gets more sun exposure than in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, the Caribbean islands. So it would be harder to plant in Africa than it would be in the Americas. I mean, it would be harder to plant in the Americas than Africa, because you wouldn't even understand the science to planting in the Americas when all you saw was dirt in the sub-Saharan Africa, dirt in sub-Saharan Africa. And the sun exposure is different. How would you know how much sunlight the plants in America need? How would you know how to pick cotton? Who was teaching you? Again, how would you know anything? Sugarcane, tobacco. The Europeans learned it from the Indians, who then the very same Indians they claim they had to send to school for them to teach how to do it. This shit confusing. It don't even make sense. It's literally said Native American boarding schools primarily aim to assimilate the students into mainstream U.S. culture, teaching them Western values, skills, knowledge. They were taught subjects like math, science, history, English, alongside practical skills such as farming. Why would you need to teach an Indian on their land how to farm? Wouldn't they know more than the European? Shouldn't they be the ones teaching the Europeans how to farm? Make that make sense. Make it make sense. Somebody kill somebody. But then these Africans, who nobody got no book saying that these Indians taught them how to farm. There's no book saying this. They said, and then somebody had the nerve to say to me in the comment section, well, don't you think the Europeans would have taught the Africans how to farm? I said no. Because remember, they was dying. They were dying of famine, right? The great famine that happened in like 15, something like that. The great famine, they didn't know how to farm. So what are you talking about? They couldn't have got no Africans and taught them how to farm when they themselves was dying for the inability to know how to farm. Make that make sense. But somehow these Africans come from a different country, know how to cultivate your land, while the Native Americans who's supposed to know how to cultivate the land, that went to school taught by the Europeans who learned from the Indians on how to cultivate the land. This shit just don't add up and make no sense. Who taught the Africans? The Europeans dying of starvation, the Indians going to school to know how to farm. Well, then who the fuck taught the Africans how to farm? Niggas is going to school to learn it. And the Europeans is dying because they don't know how to farm. This shit ain't... I'm going to tell you why it don't add up. I'm going to tell you why it don't add up. Because shit like this, you know that them so-called black folk that they claim they got from Africa. Because think of it. Why would I export labor on farming, for farming and agriculture, when on their arrival they would die? And I would be wasting money. I would be better if it would be better for me financially if I put to work the Aboriginals of America who already know how to farm. It would make better sense if I allied with them to get for them to capture neighboring Indian groups that they were fighting with, enslaving them and getting them to work the field, than it would be for me to export Africans. That's not smart business practice to go, now you got to teach a whole bunch of Africans how to cultivate the land that you don't even know how to cultivate yourself, and you dying. And then you got to send the Native Americans to school because they don't know how to farm the land. So who the hell is the Indians then? Think about the words. The Indians taught the Spanish, Portuguese, Pilgrims, and Europeans how to farm. And the Native Americans had to go to Indian school to learn how to farm. So the question is, who are the Native Americans? Because they can't be the Indians, because they had to go to school to learn how to farm, where an Indian already knew how to farm because it's his land. And the only people you see on these farms are brown-skinned folk that they claim they got from Africa. Bad business practice, because who would export labor where you got to pay and hope these people survive the whole duration of the seabearing years, and you got to be able to train them how to be. Do you not understand that they said they beat and whip these people and put them to work? How would they know how to work on a farm they never been on? Again, Africa gets more sun exposure on their soil than in Virginia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina. So how would any African know how to cultivate lands like that? Sub-Saharan African soil is way different from the soil in the South and in the North. And in the North of America. So make that make sense. This a little question that been running through my mind. You get what I mean? This lets you know that them Native Americans ain't Indian. They're from the Bering Strait. To be an Indian means to be an Aboriginal, right? From the beginning. If you from the Bering Strait, then you ain't from no beginning. Somebody here was here before you. And the murals prove it when you go to Bunnapuck. When you go and dig up the murals in, all throughout New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, you got black people burial grounds, some Indian burial grounds. Those black folk are the Indians. And this proves it if the Native Americans went to school to learn how to farm lands that should be theirs. So my question is, who are the Native Americans? Because they for damn sure can't be Indians if they didn't even know how to farm their own land and they had to go to boarding schools. The boarding school taught you how to farm your land, and the foreigners wouldn't even know how to, they were dying, right? So you talk about the Spanish, the Portuguese, the European, they were dying of starvation because they didn't know how to cultivate the land. They were eating their wives. Again, look what happened in Roanoke. In Roanoke, what happened? The settlers, the foreign settlers, were literally becoming cannibals because they didn't know how to cultivate lands. They didn't know how to catch the animals that was in America. They were unfamiliar with them. Only people who knew this was the American Indian, right? The same American Indian that turned around and got to go to school for cultivating lands. Why is there a loss of time? They forgot? Did these Native Americans forget how to farm their own land? And then simultaneously while the Europeans remember? Make that shit make sense. That's all. That's a little food for thought. Okay? Because the math ain't mathing. Something ain't right. Something ain't right. Anyway, put your comments down below if you understand this. Put it down below. Like, share, and subscribe. Stay up, stay blessed. Put God first above all else. Peace out.